This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topic tonight, two parts. We're going to analyze Trump's 28 or is it 19-point peace plan now, and the recent national security strategy. Everybody in this part of the world, in Russia and across Europe, are talking about it. It's huge. And tonight, I'm going to talk about this and analyze this with somebody that's been a very good friend for a long time, someone that just about everybody is familiar with, Professor Peter Kuznick. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you, Regis. Thanks for having me again.
It's always a pleasure, Peter. You've got so much to say and such incredibly important insights. And I'm looking forward to going through this with you tonight. I started out by saying, you know, there's a peace plan that Donald Trump has been pushing. The Russians are saying, well, and we're listening. There's some things there that we don't agree with, but it's a starting point. And the Russians have been saying, we don't want to engage in bullhorn diplomacy. Lavrov, on the other hand, says the diplomacy has taken place not out in the news, but with diplomats, which really is interesting when you think that it's been Steve Witkoff and recently Jared Kushner who've been getting all the news. So, Peter, what are your thoughts on this peace plan, whether it's 28 points or 19 points? Do you think it's going to go anywhere?
But the point you made about the diplomats, one of the things that struck me about the negotiation that took place with Witkoff and Kushner was that Lavrov was not at the table. I mean, Lavrov is the renowned, esteemed, experienced, leading Russian diplomat, and he wasn't part of the discussions. You had Dmitriev there and Ushakov, but you didn't have Lavrov. This was really talking about economic deals, business deals, financial arrangements, which might be the underpinning of a long-term solution. But I was struck by the fact that they didn't have the usual diplomats there. I mean, Kirill Dmitriev has been involved in very important discussions, especially with Witkoff, about the Bering Strait Tunnel, about oil deals and gas deals and nuclear deals and space issues, but not about, you know, but it struck me as a little bit revealing about how the US and Russia are looking at steps going forward. Back to your question, though,
if I can jump in,
please, always.
You made it one of the most important points that is being overlooked by a lot of people, and so I want to talk a little bit more about that. Business deals you mentioned. Yeah. Witkoff is a businessman. He's a real estate developer. Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, Trump's son-in-law, is a real estate developer. They had eyes on building a Trump Atlantic City casino on the bones of the Palestinians on the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And Trump was recently quoted, he's so ignorant, he doesn't understand. He said, Crimea is surrounded by 4 oceans. And I can just see Kushner and Witkoff thinking, oh man, we can have a Trump casino and resort and golf course right here in Crimea, maybe just on the outskirts of Yalta. And the point that you made, the distinction that you made, Peter, is so important for people to understand. Who was not there? Lavrov.
And it's one of the reasons why this whole thing might not work, why this might be resolved ultimately on the battlefield, is Trump seems to have a good instinct to realize that Ukraine is losing and that we need to end the fighting and settle this at the bargaining table, because it's only going to get worse for Ukraine and not going to really get better for Russia. Uh, but he doesn't have the mental capability, the advisors, the expertise, or the patience to see this through. We know the way other wars have ended, whether it was Vietnam or Korea, which never really ended, or other wars that take sometimes years at the bargaining table to hammer out a deal. And the question is whether Trump actually has the staying power, the stamina, the mental awareness to do that. In the US, one of the big jokes of late is that Trump seems to be falling asleep in every meeting he's at. And there are all these memes of him and video footage of Trump sleeping. He's what, 79 years old, but there are 79-year-olds who are very sharp. There are 100-year-olds who are still very sharp. But Trump never had that kind of intellectual, mental discipline, and never really was that kind of a thinker, a long-term strategic thinker. I mean, he can be quick, and he can come up with some witty sayings here and there, and he can read people very well, but he doesn't have the expertise and the people around him, the Rubios. I mean, it was a good thing that Rubio and Hegseth were left out of this, that he sent Driscoll over to meet with the Ukrainians. Uh, but, he just doesn't have the people around him or the expertise, and he's been firing people and dismantling the bureaucracies and getting rid of the experts who might be able to hammer out a deal. So that's one of the big problems. Another of the big problems is he's dealing with the Europeans and Zelensky. And we look at Macron and Starmer and Merz and Rutte and Callas. These are not exactly the sharpest and most popular leaders. If we look at their approval ratings, Macron's approval ratings are somewhere between 11% and 15%. How you can do worse than that, I don't know. Starmer's approval ratings are 19%. Mertz's approval ratings are are 23%.
And that's
Zelensky's,
that's probably being charitable.
well, and yeah, it shouldn't be that high. But Zelensky's approval ratings a couple months ago were up in the 60s. Now the best informed experts say they're under 20%.
Yep.
So what we're dealing with is not only intellectual, you know, people who have a vision that's very, very stunted, but people who have no popular support at home. Part of why Trump recently and Putin for much longer has been insisting that there be elections in Ukraine, because they say we can't trust it if it's that Zelensky's been hanging on through martial law and hasn't held elections, and now with his approval plummeting largely because of this huge corruption scandal that's rocking Ukraine. People thought that Yermak was the real power in Ukraine, but Yermak was taken down by this, as have other members of the cabinet, and even Umarov, who's been doing a lot of negotiating, has been implicated. So this is all Zelensky's closest advisors who have been taken down as a result. The Ukrainian people seem to be rejecting Zelensky, on top of the situation on the battlefield, where the Ukrainians are deserting at record numbers.
Oh
The
boy.
number in October apparently was 21,000 desertions. So what we've had is maybe 300,000 people who've been prosecuted by Ukrainian authorities for being AWOL or deserting since the beginning of the fighting. That number is increasing geometrically at this point. The idea, as John Kerry once said, nobody wants to be the last person to die for a lie. And he said that about Vietnam. But it's also true in this situation, with morale is plummeting, they're losing on the battlefield. The prospects get worse by the day. I can't blame the Ukrainians. Whatever you might think of how wise they've certainly been brave. They've certainly battled the Russians tenaciously on the battlefield. And there's a, begrudging respect that everybody has for how they've handled themselves. But now they don't, the incentive to keep doing that is declining and evaporating. So I don't know if we have civilizational erasure, but we are in the process of having military erasure in Ukraine. But you can tell me which direction you'd like to go with this.
No, it's fantastic because it's a great analysis of what's going on. And, a lot of people are just waking up to this. Most people are probably not even aware of what's going on. So what you're saying is extremely important. Now, I want to go back to Starmer. I want to go back to Macron, Merz, and von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas. Peter, you talked about approval ratings of some of these people. Not only the approval ratings are extremely low and plummeting, really, but these are people that there's an expression in Latin that I like to use, minus habens. We refer to people having less up here. Yeah. They're not very bright. And these people, Peter, you just have to listen to them. There's no depth. Sometimes they're even speaking incoherently, but they're all speaking from the same script.
Yes.
You see it across the board. So, Peter, this is the question before we go on. This conflict doesn't just involve Russia and Ukraine and the United States. Trump, who's really a participant in this, yes. I don't know how we can be a deal breaker. But, Peter, in order to find a peaceful solution, which involves the security of all of these countries, Europe right now is terrorized. Their people, by the leaders telling them Russia's going to invade, we're going to have a war with Russia. Not to have these people.
You know who said that yesterday? Rutte. Did you hear what he said? He said that in 5 years, we're likely going to be at war, and it's going to be on the scale of the war of our grandfathers and great grandfathers. So it's going to be on the scale of World Wars I and II. Well, that in itself is delusional, because
insane.
In Europe, there's going to be nuclear war, and that's going to be on make World Wars I and II look like a walk in the park compared to Europe.
Peter,
like after that.
Don't you think that all of these countries should be involved in whatever negotiations are going on?
Yes,
because Peter, Trump is saying, and this drives me crazy, how devious it is. He says, we're not going to get involved. We're going to pull back, but we're going to keep selling the Europeans the equipment, the weapons, and we're going to let them keep fighting. Is this a deal maker? I mean, Peter, how insane is that?
It's not only insane, it's immoral. It's deeply immoral. Yeah. And what Trump is realizing is that Europe now is not the Europe of old. That Europe used to represent 42% and even more of global GDP. And now Europe is down to 13% of global GDP and declining. And the European economies are shrinking. Russia grew at 4% the last 2 years, but Russia's economy is somewhat stagnant at this point too, maybe a 1% growth rate this year, but even that is better than most of the Europeans. And now that the Europeans, pressured by Trump, what I consider idiocy, are committing themselves to spending 5% of GDP on their militaries, they're going to do that by cutting the social programs. The thing that made Europe great and distinctive was that they didn't waste all their money on their militaries after World War II. but now they're going to do that, which means that as unpopular as these leaders are, this is the most popular they're going to be. Because once they start cutting that social safety net, cutting the housing, the food, the health care, they're going to get thrown out of office, which they should be thrown out of office for a lack of vision. And you see what's going on elsewhere. You've got the rise of the BRICS. You've got the rise of the SCO, the rise of the African Union. The global South, broadly conceived, is the emergent force for positivity and development around the world. And the Europeans are clinging to this war message. And so the point you were making before, they're trying to scare their publics into spending 5% of GDP on the militaries. The only way they could get the European publics to support that is to scare the crap out of them. And how do you do that? You say that for Putin, Ukraine is the appetizer, after which he's coming after the real prize. That's going to be your sons and daughters. So you're going to have the Russian military and rapists. And, always this issue of the image of the Russian hordes who are going to do to Europe what they did to Germany after World War II. Well, there are reasons why they did that after Germany killed 27 million Soviets during World War II, and the Soviet troops were ready to get their revenge. But they're creating this image again of the beast at the door, and we have to stand up to them. And that's what Callas says, and that's what Rutte says, and Macron and Starmer and Merz. We just celebrated or commemorated the Pearl Harbor Day in the United States, 4 days ago now. And to me, to see a resurgent Japanese militarism and resurgent German militarism is the last thing the world needs. And Merz is a total hawk in that regard, and is really almost being more aggressive toward Russia than Starmer and Macron are. So I think that we're going the wrong direction, and it's extremely upsetting and very, very dangerous. And these people have got to be stopped. And I don't like to see these far right parties doing it, because I think that's the opposite direction of which we need to go. But at least they recognize, some of them, that we can't have unlimited military spending and forever wars and treat Russia as a perennial enemy. The kind of Russophobia that we see in much of the world is very, very corrosive.
Peter, so we're painting a very negative picture of all the dynamics that are surrounding this conflict in Ukraine, that Trump is searching for some way out of it. Is this peace plan, is it dead in the water? And I'd like, because you're very familiar with Russia, you've been here so many times, you have many contacts here. What do you think, if you're sitting having tea or you're having vodka with some of the people surrounding Putin and Lavrov, how do you think they're reacting to this peace plan?
I think they're happier with the national security strategy than they are with the peace plan from the Russian perspective. I mean, Putin has been there for almost 4 years now. The Russians have lost a lot of people. I don't know what figures to trust on this, but the Western media, at least, says that Russia has lost more than 1 million men to death and injuries. Is that conceivable? I hope not, but it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands. And they are not going to give up. From the very beginning, Russia said this is about settling the roots of this conflict. And the roots of the conflict go back to NATO expansion. Clearly, Gorbachev was given a promise by Bush and Baker and the Germans and everybody else that NATO would not expand, 1 inch to the east if they allowed the unification of Germany. And NATO, I studied the documents, and before 1990 was up, NATO was already having meetings discussing expansion. They postponed it because they had Yeltsin in there and he was bumbling around and doing whatever uh, Clinton wanted. So they postponed it really to 1998. But after that, they've been expanding to further. So there was Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but then they started expanding after Putin took over more and more countries. And so, and then in 2008, you've got George W. Bush talking about fast tracking Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Uh, U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, later CIA director, sends a memo back to the White House titled "Niet means Niet, don't cross Russia's red lines." They knew this, and they knew this with the uprising in the Maidan uprising and the overthrow. They knew what they were doing there with this coup, and it did put Russia in the position which Kennan warned, Bill Bradley warned, a lot of other statesmen warned, was going to force Russia to have a military response if we keep on expanding. And so when they took over when they overthrew Yanukovych in 2014, this all became almost inevitable. And it could have been avoided, should have been avoided, if we had statesmen. Obama, to give him a little bit of credit, refused to give lethal aid to Ukraine. He said Ukraine is so much more of a strategic issue for Russia than it is for the United States and Europe and other Europeans, that we're not going to give lethal aid. And Trump comes in there and he starts providing lethal aid. But he says he wants to be friends with Russia and starts praising Putin. But if you look at what he actually did, which is what I warned about repeatedly to my Russian friends when I would go over there, that in the long run, a warmonger like Hillary Clinton would be more in Russia's interest because she's at least stable and predictable. To have somebody as rash and reckless and impulsive as Trump in there is actually more dangerous. Well, Trump's first term, they avoided war. And now Trump, what if you look at his national security strategy, what he's saying about Russia and Ukraine might be more positive. But if you look at it in total, some of the quotes from it, he says in national strategy that the goal is to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, most successful country for decades to come. Some are reading it as if the U.S. is backing off from global domination and hegemony. That's not what the national security strategy is saying. It's saying what Hegseth said, saying what Rand said. Rand issued a report a couple of years ago called Avoiding a Prolonged War, saying that the United States has got to end the war in Ukraine so we can get to the real concern, and that's China. And that we can't even give enough arms to Taiwan because we're giving the arms to Russia, giving the arms to Ukraine under Biden, and then we started giving the arms to Israel. And so Taiwan, which is our real concern, is getting the short shrift here. However, if you look at the new security strategy, it talks about China, even though it doesn't explicitly talk about China as an enemy the way it did under Biden or even Trump the first time. If you look at what they're talking about, let me read to you one of the key statements there. It says, we will build a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain. But the American military cannot and should not have to do this alone. Our allies must step up and spend, and more importantly, do much more for collective defense. America's diplomatic efforts should focus on pressing our first island chain allies and partners to allow the U.S. military greater access to their ports and other facilities, to spend more on their own defense, and more importantly, to invest in capabilities aimed at deterring aggression. Well, they talk about here again this idea that the U.S. is going to step back, and instead of burden sharing, what they're talking about is burden shifting. We want to shift the burden to South Korea. We want to shift the burden to Japan. We want to shift the burden to Taiwan so that the U.S. does not have to be, big brother and everybody's defender in that regard. But the reality is the U.S. is intent upon maintaining hegemony. Uh, Obama and Clinton began talking about the Asia pivot in late 2011. Hillary Clinton wrote her article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century. That the United States is going to dominate the Pacific, and we're going to shift from the Middle East and Europe to Asia increasingly. And then you've got Ishiba in Japan, who was the prime minister before Takaichi now, and he said that Japan should have its own nuclear weapons and that we need an Asian NATO. The new national security strategy says that there will be no additional NATO expansion, or even the points that the 28-point program called for ending NATO expansion, which was a good thing, a necessary thing. However, they're talking about, so let me backtrack a little. The real threat in the Pacific is over Taiwan, right? As you and I have talked about before. But the U.S. strategy for dealing with Taiwan, as Admiral Davidson said some years ago, where U.S. troops are based in Hawaii and Guam, would take 3 weeks before U.S. troops got to Taiwan, to the Taiwan Strait. But even though this goes against U.S. policy was supposed to be strategic ambiguity, that we wouldn't say what we would do if China tried to take Taiwan by force. But Biden said on 4 separate occasions that the U.S. would engage militarily. The Japanese strategy is also supposed to be strategic ambiguity. But Takaichi, in response to a question just weeks ago, said that Japan, this would represent an existential threat to Japan, which means that she didn't say it, but everybody knows what it means, that Japan is committed to sending troops to Taiwan to defend Taiwan. Well, Japan not only has 50,000 plus American troops there, but it's got its own large self-defense forces. So even though Article 9 is still on the books, nobody takes it seriously anymore. So now they've changed the rules of engagement that Japan can defend the interests of allies in the Pacific. And so we know that what will happen is that if there is fighting over Taiwan, the U.S. gains operational control over the South Korean military. And so the U.S. can take care of those troops as well as the 28,500 U.S. troops and send them in. And then the troops from Japan get in there. And the U.S. have been talking about interoperability with the Japanese troops. So effectively, the U.S. takes control of those also. And that's we do to stall China until the rest of the U.S. troops can get in there. Still, China will likely win in its immediate backyard, because it's less than 100 miles from Taiwan. So China has tremendous advantages. It's been building up its Navy, building up its Air Force, and ever since Nancy Pelosi's idiotic visit there, which was just pure provocation, China's been crossing the midline in this strait there and sending their planes across the midline into what Taiwan considers its own defense zone. And so what we have is these crazy warmongers who are pushing war policies in both, well, certainly in the Pacific and also in Ukraine now. So the broad picture is not a good one now. And then on top of that, you've got Trump's national security strategy saying that we want a new Monroe Doctrine. We're going to take all of Latin America and Central America, our America's backyard, and we can intervene at will to overthrow governments we don't like, to destroy boats that we think might be carrying drugs, even though we know that that's not where the drugs are coming into the United States. The drugs coming into the United States are coming in overland through from Colombia to Mexico, or else in the Pacific route. It's almost 80-something% of the drugs. But we're shooting down these boats there, killing people without any legality to this, and because we want to show how tough we are, how strong we are, that we're the bullies. And, so you got people like Hegseth. He wants to show how macho he is. And he's says we're changing the name of the Department of Defense to the War Department, which is what it was before 1947. Well, maybe us being more honest as to what it is, but his warrior mentality is really sick. And this is the kind of leadership that the U.S. is exerting right now.
Peter, what I think you did, you had to step back and look at the larger picture and what this national security document strategy is really all about. America is not backing off from its need and its desire to be the hegemon, to dominate. It's just now using others to bear some of the burden. But when you forget about the language, and as you've just pointed out, if you look at what the United States is actually doing, you see there isn't any change whatsoever in its strategy. And let's get back now to Russia.
Yes.
You and I both know that the West has been trying to invade and rape and pillage Russia's resources for hundreds of years. The Swedes, you can go back to the Finns, you can go back to Napoleon, you go back certainly to the Crimean War, to Hitler. And these people, whoever they are that are behind it, are not going to stop. Now, Peter, I want your comment on one more thing about why maybe they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And part of it has to deal with their declining economies. They need those Russian resources. The stupidity of, short-sightedness of cutting off Russian oil, of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. This is self-defeating for Europe. Trump wants to flood Europe with cheap liquefied natural gas from the United States. But Europe, one of the good things that could potentially come out of this, Trump has been trying to lure Russia to accept this deal, even though, as you suggested in the beginning, there are many provisions that go against Russia's interests. You wouldn't know that from watching American media on any of this. The U.S. keeps saying that this 28-point peace plan was drawn up by the Russians, that it represents all of Russia's interests. It went even worse. Rachel Maddow, what did she say? I wrote this down somewhere. And she said that the 28-point peace plan is proof that the Kremlin runs U.S. foreign policy. This was a deal that the Russians reject many aspects of, but they're in a strong position. But we see, for example, Germany. The thought that Germany is playing this role again is really mind-boggling. Nikita Khrushchev understood it. And he said to an American journalist back in 61 or 62, he said, "I can understand how Americans look at Germany somewhat differently than we do. We have a much longer history with Germany. We've seen how quickly governments in Germany can change and how easy it is for Germany to become an instrument of mass murder. It's hard for us even to count the number of our people who were killed by Germany in the last war. We have a saying here, quote, give a German a gun, sooner or later he will point it at Russians. This is not just my feeling. I don't think there's anything the Russian people feel more strongly about than the question of the rearmament of Germany. You like to think in the United States that we have no public opinion. Don't be too sure about this. On the matter of Germany, our people have very strong ideas. I don't think that any government here could survive if it tried to go against it. I told this to one of your American governors, and he said he was surprised that the Soviet Union, with all its atomic bombs and missiles, would fear Germany. I told your governor he missed the point. Of course, we could crush Germany. We could crush Germany in a few minutes. What we fear is the ability of an armed Germany to commit the United States by its own actions. We fear the ability of Germany to start a world atomic war. What puzzles me more than anything else is that the Americans don't realize there's a large group in Germany that is eager to destroy the Soviet Union. How many times do you have to be burned before you respect fire? You know, and to see Merz with this aggressiveness now toward Russia, this obsession with inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, and we're going to, this idea we're going to keep arming and financing Ukraine to keep on fighting and dying for this illusion. I mean, what we know is that Ukraine cannot claw back the territory it's lost. We know that the other big lie of this is that once Putin gets a win in Ukraine, he's going to go after the rest of Russia and I mean the rest of Europe. This is lunacy. This is not what Ukraine represents. Something very, very different to Putin than any other part of Europe does. And but to spread those lies, those falsehoods, and Rutte and Rasmussen and you know and Callas talking about sending European troops to defend Ukraine. Macron has been talking about doing this. The coalition of the willing, they're not going to send their troops there. The last thing the European publics want is to see their kids slaughtered in fighting against Russia. There's no support for that. But you've got these leaders who have no popular support who are endorsing that kind of madness. So it's unfortunate, it's tragic, and it's lunacy, uh, given the realities there.
As a historian, you pointed out what Khrushchev said in that lengthy piece that you read, how the Russians see Germany. And not many people can understand how the Russians sees the last 1,000 years of being invaded constantly by others. And Peter, it's always been, you pointed it out, they need Russia's resources.
Yes.
That's been the whole goal of colonialism, the Western European colonialists, going back to Great Britain. They didn't have the resources. No. The rest of Europe did. And now...
And Japan never had the resources either.
Yes. So
that empire, they wanted that empire because they couldn't sustain their invasion of China without getting the oil from the Dutch East Indies.
So that should help people understand why Trump is sending Witkoff and Kushner to Russia, because they're saying now, well, we don't want to fight you, but we want to get our hands on that money. We want to have deals for oil, for gold, for platinum, for your timber.
Because it's so easy. I mean, if we compare the Trump national security strategy with Biden's, okay, Biden saw this idea of American domination, but he saw a unified U.S. and Europe. Biden stressed allies. Trump doesn't give a shit about allies. Trump wants, underlings. He wants other countries to do the U.S. bidding. He wants empire on the cheap. It's not that he doesn't want empire. He wants empire. He wants it on the cheap. And he wants all these people to keep on bribing the United States with investments, with deals, and to, hundreds of billions of dollars of investments that he wants. At the same time, they bribe him by investing in his Bitcoin operations and his currency things and his other businesses, and they build towers to him and they pay homage to him. I don't understand how fragile this guy's ego is. But if you watch any of these cabinet meetings, they go around and one cabinet member after another tries to outdo the one before him in saying why Trump is the greatest president ever. And then if they don't say it enough, then Trump. I reminded of Kim Jong-un. One of the reasons why he had his uncle executed was that his uncle didn't clap vociferously enough when Kim came into the room. I could see Trump doing that with the members of his own cabinet. If they don't praise him enough, butter him up, flatter him, tell him how great he is, he's going to drop them from the cabinet. And I see that's why Hegseth has survived, because he's performs more fellatio on Trump in public than any of the other cabinet members. And we're just not dealing with a normal presidency or the United States as a normal country at this point. And it's sad to see what's happening in this country, like it's sad to see what's happening in Europe. So that's why I look so much to, I want the US to play a good role. I want the US to be a leader in a positive way. At least Biden, was really stupid about it, but at least he talked about democracy and American values. We didn't live up to it. We've never lived up to it. That's the tragedy of American history, is that it was, the United States was founded in large part on slavery. And, it's true that, genocide of the Native Americans and denying of white rights to women. And, but at least it had certain ideals that were universal, that it tried to live up to and made reforms and changed things in a positive direction. And now we're going in the backward direction. So part of the reason why Trump says that Europe is facing civilizational erasure is because he doesn't like that there are so many non-whites in Europe. I see that as a strength, as a future, as a direction the world is going. Trump, given his racism and his ethno-nationalism, sees that as the root of European decline. It's sad, but the world is changing no matter how many these guys try to hold back the tide.
Let's talk about this a little more. The world is changing. You mentioned much earlier in the discussion BRICS and this new fast emerging multipolar world.
Yeah.
So in terms of this conflict in Ukraine, how do you see that ending?
How do I see it?
The conflict in Ukraine ending. And then the other thing that I want to lead to is, well, if it gets over, will the United States ever take its rightful place as just one among equals with the rest of the nations, BRICS and the global South? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that this is happening despite the United States. Joni Mitchell sings about, the circle game, trying to drag the 20-year-old trying to drag his feet to slow the circles down. But you can't stop aging, no matter how much you try to resist it. And the United States can't stop multipolarity, no matter how much it tries to resist it. Trump has explicitly threatened the BRICS. He's threatened to destroy all of those countries and is effectively trying to do that now through his tariff policies. But the BRICS are expanding, and the global South is expanding. And even Modi and Xi Jinping realizing that fighting over the Himalayas or any of the tension between them is hurting the ability of the global South to unite behind Chinese and Indian leadership. I mean, we're talking about two countries, each of which has 1.4 billion people and represents the future in a lot of ways. I don't like a lot of things about Modi. There are a lot of things about China that I would hate if I lived there. But I see them having a vision for development, peaceful development. The Belt and Road program might not again be perfect, but it's the only game in town when it comes to global development in a positive way. And India, I've done several speaking tours in India. I love it in India. The dynamism, the potential for growth, the excitement with learning there. is ubiquitous, and so I see that part of the world having a lot of potential, and Russia too. So many things that I disapprove of. Um, I believe strongly in press freedom. I believe that dissent is the lifeblood of a country. And if I were Putin or Xi, I would welcome dissent. I would urge there to be more dissent. I wouldn't fear it. I would, and, well, it's so much that we can get into on that. But um, the overall thrust, what I see in terms of ending the war in Ukraine, I wish it would happen now at the bargaining table. Uh, I think there's a pretty universal recognition that Ukraine is not only losing on the battlefield, but they're losing at an accelerating pace. And now with the taking of Pokrovsk. And so if Zelensky, if Ukraine still controls 20 to 25% of Donetsk, this is today, the thing that's so, again, disturbing to me is that from the Ukrainian standpoint, today is the strongest they are going to be. Today is the best bargaining position they're going to have. That if, as long as this goes on, they're going to lose more ground, more of their economy is going to be destroyed, more of their infrastructure is going to be destroyed, and more humans they're going to lose to dead and wounded. Now, it's also in Russia's interest to settle this, but Putin has made clear that he holds the cards, that he's not going to give up in negotiations what he knows he can take on the battlefield, however slowly, however, it's going to be a grind to do it. Russia is going to prevail on the battlefield, and Putin is not going to accept agreement that's going to give up what he considers the elements that are going to get at the roots of the conflict. And so,
Peter, let me jump in because I want you to continue on this. Much of the talk here that I'm hearing now is that the longer this goes, it's onward to Odessa. Many of these war correspondents and bloggers are saying Putin is going to go all the way to Odessa because he has to. If he doesn't, what that's going to do is allow NATO, is going to allow United States to be able to utilize that. And they claim that that is Russia's final red line. What are your thoughts on that?
well, I'm not expert on that, so I'd defer to you on that, Regis. But um, I'm that gives more reason why Ukraine should end this now, why they should accept the broad elements of the deal where it stands now. One of the things that we know is that you see how things changed dramatically in the United States. To go from George W. Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, back to Trump. And then there's going to be a new government in place probably in 2028 that's going to be much more liberal, uh, progressive, left leaning than the Trump. None of these things are fixed in cement and concrete. They change. So even if Zelensky gets the agreement, the Ukrainian parliament, to put into the constitution what used to be in the constitution, that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, if Ukraine gives that up, who's to say that Zelensky 2 years from now is not going to put it back in? There are no ironclad agreements, which is why we need to figure out a solution that represents everybody's best interest. That's why I don't want to see, Zelensky or Ukraine totally obliterated and humiliated and collapsing and giving in from a moment of weakness. That's why I'd rather see a give and take exchange that reflects not only Ukraine's security interests, but Russia's security interests. And that's why I'd like to see Ukraine in the EU. Putin has said he could accept that. I want to see a strong Ukraine. I want to see a Ukraine rebuilt. I want to see a more democratic Ukraine. I want to see Ukraine that's not so corrupt. I don't want to see neo-Nazis in positions of influence in Ukraine. Even this stumbling point about the size of the Ukrainian military.
Damn.
If Ukraine's military is 600,000, it's the biggest military in Europe, right? And they can't sustain 600,000. They say they want the right to have 800,000. That would sink Ukraine's economy for decades. They can't afford that and support that. We need to be cutting all the militaries. After World War II, Henry Wallace had this idea that everybody's military would be capped at a very, very low number, and we'd move toward peaceful development. And that was his century of the common man vision. We need that. We don't need everybody militarizing. We need to cut the size of everybody's militaries. We need to drastically decrease the number of nuclear weapons. Ukraine's position is deteriorating by the day, if not by the hour. So if this goes on another 3 months, 6 months, this should never have been allowed to go on. Back in 2022, in March and April, we had the Istanbul Accords, and that was a solution. Before that, we had the Minsk Agreement, which could have been a solution had they had been smart enough to accept the Minsk II proposal, which Russia was eager to accept. Then the Donbass and Zaporizhia and Kherson would now today be part of Ukraine, and it would be a federal system with more autonomy, and we would have had 1 million plus healthy people in Russia and Ukraine able to enjoy life. But you had the idiot. First, you had Macron and Hollande saying that they were just delaying for time with the Minsk II agreement. They never took it seriously, never wanted to implement it. And then with the Istanbul Accords, you got Boris Johnson, one of the most clownish figures in European politics, going in there and blowing it up and promising to Ukraine, we're going to give you all the military support you need for as long as you need it, and the financial support. And the Europeans have kept this going with Biden's help. Biden played a very enabling role in this, and it was not ever in Ukraine's interest. The Europeans have shown that they're willing to fight and die. They're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. They don't want to send their own troops, and they don't even want to send their own money now. They want to steal Russia's money and use it that way, because they know if you give the money to Ukraine, it goes into this corruption fund. It gets siphoned off. That this corruption is still pervasive. Nobody wants to send good money, after bad, and they don't want to send. So the U.S. says that it's not going to send its own arms, but if the Europeans buy it, then we'll sell them the arms to you, send them to Ukraine. It's in Ukraine's interest to end this yesterday. It would have been in Ukraine's interest to accept the Minsk II. It would have been in Ukraine's interest to accept the Istanbul Accords. But they've been pressured and urged and convinced by the Europeans and by Biden to not do that. So, it's going to be worse. It's going to be worse if this goes on a month. It's going to be worse if it goes on in 6 months. It's going to be worse if it goes on for another year. And ultimately, Russia's going to win it on the battlefield. And Russia will take more and more of Ukrainian territory and destroy more infrastructure. And just more and more lives are going to be lost, and more of the economy is going to be destroyed. If those Europeans really cared about Ukraine, they would do everything they could to help negotiate an agreement that represents both sides' interests. Because if it's a one-sided deal, it's not going to last. And it's not in Russia's interest to humiliate, degrade, and destroy Ukraine. I mean, Putin talks about these ties between the Russians and Ukrainians. It's going to take a long time, but maybe if Russia plays a positive, constructive role in helping Ukraine rebuild, then maybe they can speed that process up of healing the deep wounds between Russia and Ukraine.
Your last thought. Russia has just been asking for security assurances.
Yeah.
They don't want to invade anybody else. They don't want to invade Europe. But I mentioned that Putin really would like to have a pan-Eurasian security agreement with all of these people from Western Europe, Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe that's a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. The whole Brzezinski doctrine was to prevent Russia from ever being a Eurasian power by taking away Ukraine. All the other neocons felt similarly about that, and that was back in 1997 with Brzezinski's grand chessboard strategy. Um, I think that given Zelensky just warned that Russia's ties to China are getting closer, getting more intense. Uh, Russia already has close ties to India. Russia, 60% of India's arms are supplied by Russia. Russia has been providing inexpensive energy to India, which is allowing India to grow at a very, very rapid rate of late. So Eurasian security, based on the BRICS, based on the SCO, based on Russia's close ties to India and China, uh, and and close ties to Africa. I mean, Russia has played a very important role in the decolonization movements throughout the world, and was appreciated by the third world when the United States was trying to defend the colonial masters. Russians were opposing it. So I think Russia is, and it's very interesting to me, Regis, that when the U.S. imposed sanctions, almost none of the developing countries, the global south, went along with them because they saw the hypocrisy. They saw that the wars that the U.S. fought repeatedly and the colonial struggles that the U.S. backed the colonial powers made all of this, you know, denunciation of Russian aggression sound hollow to most of the world because they thought of it as hypocrisy. You know, when Biden said Biden's doctrine that this is the fight between autocracy and democracy. The London Economist even at one point said, to the United States, it looks like a fight between autocracy and democracy, but to the rest of the world, it looks like a fight between autocracy and hypocrisy. That's why they refuse to go along with it. And so, yes, that kind of new order is not only possible, it's essential if we're going to survive the nuclear age and build the kind of peaceful, prosperous world that our children and grandchildren should have. You know, it should be self-evident that we don't want a world where we're divided into two camps, where there's warfare is considered a legitimate means of statecraft. That might have been the old world, but that's not the world that we want to create.